Hey, what's going on, everybody? How you doing? This is your friend Joe Driscoll. As promised, I'm here with my very good friend, Assemblywoman Pamela Hunter. How you doing, Pam?
I am fabulous. How are you today?
Excellent. So, for those of you watching, I decided I was going to start a podcast. So this will be a podcast. We will put this out on Spotify, Apple, all those things up on YouTube. So it's going to Facebook will be the first medium, and then we'll share it in other mediums as well. So for those of you who asked for it on Apple podcasts and Spotify podcasts, all that stuff, we're going to have it in all the mediums. So the name of the show is Salt City Grind. And it's not, I said political, but it's not going to be strictly political. If I feel like talking about issues, whatever I feel like talking about, I'm going to go with that and explore things that I find interesting in the Salt City. People asked if I was going to have Republicans on. The answer is yes. I will have anyone I find of interest on, but it's my show. I'm going to follow what I think is interesting. So hope that clarifies it. I'm not going to do things that I don't find interesting because I feel some obligation to give everyone a microphone in equal time. That's not how the universe works, and it's not how I work. So that being said, just to give you a little heads up. So once again, this is the first episode. I'm super excited to have my good friend and someone I deeply admire, Assemblywoman Pamela Hunter of the 128th District and currently the Onondaga County Democratic Chair. How are you doing today, Pamela?
I am doing great. I got to tell you, I'm glad that we're this is the end of the day. This is, the culmination of a very, very long day. So I'm glad I get to end it with you today.
Yes. So some points of I wanted to make sure. So are you the first African American woman to hold an assembly seat for this region?
Yes.
Yes, and the first to hold the Onondaga County Chair. So a lot of firsts. How do you feel about that? Do you is that something you think about a lot, the historical aspect of it, or is it something you just go, I'm just doing my job?
It's interesting because, we're in 2020 and we live in New York, but not the city. And, as we're having conversations about being first, it's a privilege. And also, you're thinking like, how could it be this far into a new, century and we're still talking about first? That's, a little sad, quite honestly. I'm also the only female veteran in the whole state legislature as well. So
Wow.
until last year, the year before last, when Rachel May was elected, I was the only woman representing in all of Central New York. So not only do you have the only woman, but the only person of color. And aside from Crystal Peoples-Stokes in Buffalo and David Gant in Rochester and myself, outside of New York City, we're the only people of color that represent. That doesn't include Long Island. So, you're talking about representation for a population of folks that, obviously there's lots of people of color who live outside of New York City. So that's something that I feel like we need to do a little bit better at, getting a little more diversity in upstate.
Yeah.
Obviously, what it looks like in our demographic, is different. We see that obviously in the Common Council, and that's great. We have more work to do. We have more work to do, but it is
Yeah.
a privilege.
That's great. And I can't agree more. So why don't you tell us a little bit, for those that don't know you, a little backstory about where you're from. You're a veteran. You obviously just mentioned. What led you to public office? What led you to want to get involved in the political game? What inspired you?
My son. And, I was on the city council in 2011 and I had an opportunity to be on the council. And I was on the council again in 2013, 14, and 15 before the assembly. And, it simply was, my son was younger. He's 20 years old now, but he was younger. And it was either, do I want to step up and be part of a solution, or do I want to sit back and complain? And not saying elective office is the only way that people can give back to the citizenry, because there's lots and lots of ways. It is a big responsibility. It is a big time commitment. Obviously you are away from home, especially in assembly, a lot, so you don't take that very lightly. but I felt like decisions that we need to be making for the future, I wanted to be a part of being able to do that. I am a New York State native, upstate, not from Syracuse, but I'm over 2 decades in Syracuse. So I think I'm a Syracusean. I've lived here longer in this house that I live in now than anywhere I've lived in my entire life. So I love Syracuse. You know, obviously it's my home. Um, I moved here from the Washington, D.C. area, and my husband is from here. His father actually still lives down the street from us right now. I live on the east side. And, you know, just for me, it's all about representing and having a voice for people who might not, you know, be heard and have a voice and amplify that and bring forward issues in a district that's very diverse. I always tell people I represent the most diverse district. I have urban, suburban, rural, and the Onondaga Nation as well. So I have high poverty and then wealth as well.
Do you want to give people a brief, you know, a lot of times people don't know where people represent. So you want to just give a broad stroke of the area you represent, so people who aren't as versed in the political, in the weedsness of it, know what your area is?
So I represent the town of Salina, the town of DeWitt, the town of Onondaga, the east side. I live on the east side of the city of Syracuse, and the south side, and also the Onondaga Nation. So if you're thinking of how far south, Onondaga Nation, I represent Beacon Skiff. And so if people have been to Beacon Skiff before, or Navarino, apple orchards in that area, I represent as well. As far north as the north side of Onondaga Lake, Pitcher Hill, if you're familiar with the Mattydale area, in that area as well, all the way to Bailey Road off of Route 11. So if for folks driving all the way up on the north side in Liverpool, up that way as well, I represent right down into Nedrow. And my district is really wonky because I don't have downtown Syracuse, but I do have a sliver that goes down, obviously South Salina Street, and everything on the side of the street that is uh, across from the Fireman's Park. So as you all are talking about gerrymandering, especially as we're in the county, and the state will be doing that as well. If you look at all of the maps, you know, obviously you're not supposed to break up clusters of people, especially in neighborhoods, but the demographic is very unique and interesting, and we definitely need to be working on that.
Yeah, so you mentioned briefly that the state is looking into gerrymandering. Similarly, like the city of Syracuse is, you know, we're quite proud on the council that we are, you know, with the leadership of President Hudson, we are going to be one of the first cities in the Northeast, the first city in the Northeast to do bipartisan independent redistricting. What's that conversation looking like at the state level? It's a conversation happening?
Well, the conversation will be successful if, obviously I'm a Democrat, if the Democrats are able to keep the Senate, because if the legislature doesn't remain with its current makeup, that conversation is very different, as it has been Republican in every year that they've done redistricting.
Right. So, thank you again for coming on. So a lot of the way we're going to do the format of this podcast, of this interview show, is to utilize social media to get direct engagement with constituents, with people who are following my page and your page, and people who have questions. So, you know, I would love to have Pam back as well. I'd love to have a separate one with you where we talk about just your role as the county chair, because I think that's a separate bucket. I think we could talk about the culture of the Democratic Committee in this county probably for 3 or 4 podcasts.
Probably so, yeah.
But I would love to have you back to just talk about that. But tonight I want to focus on, you know, mostly your role as an assemblywoman, and particularly in this time of COVID. So I'll go to the questions that we fielded from Facebook and from Twitter and from those sources. So I think the first one, I don't know, you know, where I had this one, but people asking about the unemployment system. We've had so many people chime in saying that they've been unable to connect to unemployment. Even as a district counselor, you know, a lot of people don't know, again, who represents them on what level and what bucket. They just know it's government and you're a representative of government, so they reach out to you. And so I've been interacting with the people in your office a lot and the people in Assemblyman Sturpey's office. I had a woman from East Syracuse call me up and send me an email and saying, can you connect? As well, I'm nowhere near your representative, but I will connect you, and she was, I believe, in your district. So tell us about what's going on with the unemployment system, overall, what your thoughts, any advice you have to people, what's going on with the unemployment, and how do we help people that are our constituents?
So COVID has brought out the best and sometimes the worst in systems.
Yep.
The unemployment system pre-COVID probably took about 60,000 unemployment claims per week, and it was over 1.5 million we're at right now. And remember, there's 19 million people in New York State, and that's people who worked last year in New York.
Right.
So somebody could have moved away and have, filing a claim right now, but that goes to the work that they did in New York in 2019. It's um, a huge problem. The New York State unemployment system is a state issue. So if people are calling you, obviously, hopefully you're forwarding them to a state representative where they live to help them.
Yep.
And it started as a technological issue. Obviously, going from 60,000 to 1.5 million is way more than any system can take. And, we're thinking, well, with technology, why does it have to be so difficult? Well, it's kind of like a roof. You don't fix your roof and there's a little leak, and then, it happens again, and then it becomes this big problem. Unfortunately, it's never been tested, to get to 1.5 million, even after 9/11 and even, with the Great Recession, we have not gotten to this level. If you think about the United States as a whole, they're up to like 25 million people across the state. And so, that's something that is going to be a significant issue going forward. People can call our office, and, Department of Labor wasn't staffed to take 1.5 million, claims. And so they have increased the claims. They have changed the technology. Some of the systems, it seems, may have failed from the transition to the old system they have with the new system. It's old unemployment. It's the pandemic unemployment assistance. People don't want to hear any of that. People want to hear, how am I going to get my money? And rightfully so. We've been having conversations with the folks at the Department of Labor to say, what can we do to facilitate this more quickly? And obviously they had more people. They, updated their technology, but it's really working through the vast amount of claims. So, for folks who are just at their wits' end and they don't know what to do, they're calling our office all day long, and we are processing, for them, sending information in for them, trying to, figure out what can we do. At the end of the day, the conversation that we're having with folks is, I know you need money. I get that. I know. But we try to work through too, have you talked to your landlord or your mortgage lender, as far as like, your rent situation or your mortgage? Is it a utility issue? Can we help you with food access? And a lot of the times, really, it's just because we're there and answer their call, because people are calling 100 times or more and no one answers the phone. And when they call us, we call them back or answer the phone. And that brings people some relief. It's very unfortunate. It has brought out the worst in a system, but it is getting better, and they are churning through the claims. Something that's going to be important post COVID is talking about, the economy and talking about what that looks like, especially as people are called back to work. What happens, when manufacturing starts back or we're open and people don't get hired back, to their jobs? Or what if, some of their jobs are slow to start, and working through what that looks like. So it's not just I'm in desperate situation right now, because people are, but how are we going to work on this problem going forward? And I think that's some of the conversation that we're having now in the legislature, is not only how do you triage what's happening right now, but how do we work on what's going to be happening with systems going forward, like housing, like education, like, the economy, those areas where we need to be having significant conversations.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw. I had a post yesterday from the historian and philosopher Yuval Harari. Basically, he was noting this exact thing, that while the health crisis is certainly terrifying, the real there's some real meat and potatoes to the economic crisis and the political crisis that's happening, and what does that look like? You're exactly what you're saying. What does it look like moving forward? So for those, if I could just shift to, so those who are in the queue for unemployment or unable to get in the queue, do we have any idea where we're at with the scale? Like, obviously you said the system is built for 60,000. We've got what, 1.5 million, do you say, something like that, claims?
Yes.
Do we know where we are in the queue? I mean, like Disneyland, would it be helpful to say, we've made it through 80,000 or we've made it through 100,000? Do we know where we are as far as getting to those other, 0.9 million people that we weren't expecting that are there?
The communication that has come back from the state, and mind you, the legislature is not
Right.
responsible for the Department of Labor, although obviously we appropriate the money, for all of the um, different departments. But it was communicated that they're 85% through all of the claims. And so if I represent 130,000 people, clearly I'm not getting 130,000, calls. And, obviously all of those aren't adults as well. But we do get significant amounts. And it's interesting though, because we get emails from people who said I filed in March and, I haven't received any callback. I, get conversations from people saying I did get some, but it's not the full amount.
Right.
And, I filed on April 20th, and how come I haven't heard anything yet? And I'm like, April 20th, that's like 2 weeks ago. But,
Right.
people want to know. I mean, it's not funny because
People are
you're
scared.
talking,
Yeah.
it's very scary.
Yeah.
We're talking about folks who seemingly outwardly, might look like everything is fine. They might live in a house, they might have a new model, car. And all of a sudden, you have lines of people who are in line for food who have never been getting assistance before. We're not talking about people who are, might be on SNAP or PA or getting some kind of assistance. We're talking about, and to me, that's the reality, is truly that elevated stock market numbers that we had pre-COVID was really not real, because truly to see that many people a month and a half away from being indigent, homeless, not having enough money, to cover themselves, really is an indicator how close to the line that a lot of people are living.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that you brought up another point in there. And so I'll go to another, we can kind of easily transition into another question I had on the list. So you said before you panic, well, not to lessen the feeling, because I know everyone is panicked and everyone feels frightened, but before you go right on the unemployment and needing that immediately, have you tried reaching out to your landlords? Have you tried, reaching out to your mortgage company, etc.? So the question I got was, why are banks being allowed to offer deferrals on mortgages only to today, that all the way back months will be due immediately as the crisis is over? Who's going to have 6 months of mortgage payments after not being able to work all this time? It seems like a trap to force people into default. So that was a question we got from someone about why are the banks saying that, the payments are going to be due at the end of the 6 months? And what can we say to constituents who have those kind of questions, in your opinion?
Well, the banking industry obviously is regulated by the federal government. And, that is definitely, if we're keeping track of how many things we need to be talking to our local congressperson about, that would be one of the things on the list. The Department of Financial Services in the state of New York obviously, regulates insurance, regulates banks on a different level than the federal government. And to the housing crisis, let me just take a step back for a minute, because as I mentioned the housing crisis before, it's a chain that we're talking about now. So if someone's worried about how do I, take care of my mortgage, and no one's going to be able to have 6 months worth, by one of the executive orders, the governor said no evictions and you can have a stay on your mortgage. Well, that sounds great. And hopefully people are getting some kind of income during that time, whether it's reduced hours at work or getting unemployment, to be able to have those conversations. It was communicated to me, that banks, depending on how a loan was written, there is not the opportunity to just put it on the back end and I'll pay it later. It's a total refinance situation. Well, how do get into a refinance situation if you don't have a job? You're not going to get refinanced. How are you going to pay that back? And so you're in a catch 22. That's where we need to be having conversations with the federal government about being able to change some of those banking rules. But relative to the housing crisis, especially, for people who are renters, the moratorium on evictions was moved from June to August, and that's great, except for, look at the little disclaimer, because it's for COVID related only. And so if you're in a situation where maybe you're on disability or you're getting some income, and you don't fit in that criteria, you might not be eligible for that extension into April. And so it's very important to be able to, have those conversations with your lender, and or your landlord. What we don't want to see happen, Joe, and the city council, and I know because I, worked on this when I was on the council, and we have solidified money from the banks who are by no means being, helpful when it comes to some of these small business loans for folks. What we don't want to see is another, Great Recession situation where we have more zombie properties because people lose their homes. We're just getting to a point now where we're working on blight, we're working on issues where we don't have zombie properties, where, sometimes we're having to, take properties, or, we're having to demo properties because they're in disrepair. We need to be able to, and again, as we're forward thinking, be able to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Those kind of specific conversations need to be happening. Kicking the can down the road doesn't help if a huge population of people now becomes renters and not homeowners. Banks don't want to own properties, then they just sit vacant. Blight happens, vandalism happens. We need to be forward thinking about that.
Yeah, you really hit so many points there, and it's just been, as what how it is in government. You feel like you're Sisyphus, like always trying to push this rock up the hill to see incremental changes on things that you wish that they would just completely, like you want to fix things completely. You don't want to get them a little bit better, but you realize that the only way you can do it is by making things a little bit better a time at a go. And so to see something like this, it's been really hard for me to keep my my spirits up, because so much of what we're doing can be unerased. And unfortunately, the point you raise, in arguing with people that we have so many political theorists and experts on Facebook that know everything, but there's so much that I've learned since taking office. But really, so much of how this pans out, this pandemic and all the crisis with COVID, is down to the federal government. We are, like you're talking about, with the banks, with how this is all going to go, and I'm just really having a hard time with when the response from Mitch McConnell is let New York file for bankruptcy. When we see that the work that people in city council have done, that the mayor has done, the county executive, everyone at our state delegation, all of us trying to hold the rope and keep back the floods, and working to try to improve the quality of life for our constituents here. And then just to have someone like Mitch just say, you know what, just go bankrupt, just file. It's just maddening. I don't know if there's a question in there, but
I think though, some of the conversation is understanding, how government works. I mean,
yeah.
The comptroller just today, released the April sales tax information, and it said for April it was down 24%. Well, for municipality, and that's just for April, the month of April alone. So for municipalities who are reliant on sales tax, like the city, like the county, well, what does that mean? And I think sometimes people don't understand what that means. Well, sales tax comes, I'm not trying to, patronize anybody here, or be patronizing, but, if you are at a restaurant buying food, if you are, going out buying clothes at Marshall's, if you are, going to Destiny, if you're staying in a hotel, and to the tune of millions of dollars. And so for every day that we're not getting sales tax receipts, for every month that we're not getting sales tax receipts, it trickles down state, county, local municipality. And so where there has been deficit before with the city, and with some counties, there has been relief from the state. Obviously, I work with you and many others saying, hey, we need money to fix our road, or,
Right.
can we get some capital money to, I've given money to the War Memorial. I've given money to fix the pillars on the PSB building. I spent $500,000 for the West Onondaga Street. I mean, it's like, hey, state, can you help? I can list $22 million worth of money that I've allocated, back since I've been in the assembly for 5 years, but that money isn't there. The state is in a $13 billion deficit. And not only do we have resources that we aren't able to give to municipalities to help you out because you're going through your budget situation, but let's not just talk about municipalities. Let's talk about people who are in group home, people who are on Medicaid, people who are getting services from a myriad of not-for-profits that we all know and love, that, are helping, people in our community immensely. What about education? All of those things come from the state. And, we're talking about a huge deficit. That means people are going to be cut. Programs, are going to be cut. We saw with the state, people are being furloughed, in the county as well. This is going to be far reaching. And there's no way to quickly replace that amount of money unless we have revenue, enhancements from the state. And we also, get significant monies from the federal government. And at this point, it's like crickets. We're not hearing anything. And, to hear someone say someone should go bankrupt, we're talking about 19 million people. And, to me, that's a disservice to someone who takes an oath saying that they're going to, protect the people, who they're representing, to say, you go fend for yourself. Our taxpayers, the people who live in our neighborhood, have, contributed to the economy. For someone to turn around and say, you resident, aren't worth our help, that's, not going to be acceptable. And for me and all of the state delegation, and for, the county and even the city folks, have been pushing back and saying, no, this is not going to be acceptable. But we have to keep that pressure up, because if we don't get help from the federal government, even if we included all of the revenue enhancement pieces of legislation that we have introduced, will not get us out of the deficit that we're in right now.
Yeah, it's really, oh man, it drives me nuts. I keep thinking of the quote that was attributed to Stalin, that, one person starving is a tragedy and a million people starving is a statistic. And I think that people, I hear a lot of people, especially Trump supporters, who have kind of been like, well, this chaos is good. Politics wasn't functioning how it should. And it's a lot of, you can get existential on it and theoretical on it, but when you have to look at these nursing homes and these, and see the actual impact of what this is going to be, what Mitch McConnell's saying, New York State go bankrupt, what that actually looks like, and what a society looks like when you have to put your loved one in a home with no funding, or whatever it looks like, with the quality of life we have. There's already so many things that we come across as representatives where you're like, oh, this is shameful, this is horrible. There's so much stuff in the world that's already not up to snuff. And then, this is going to create this massive windfall. And it just drives me nuts that people can just, you can sit, and it's an example of modern day privilege, that people can just say, well, go bankrupt and see what happens. And blah, it's like, are you aware what this is going to look like? But, well, I don't want to turn this whole episode into me losing my mind.
No, I mean, but every day we were all on that, almost path. And I was reading an article the other day. I can't remember. Every day there's a different article, but the woman who is in New York City right now, and she said that there's a couple of things that could happen, and one of the things is collective rage. Where all of us could just get so beside ourselves that collectively we could do something, together. And I think, people are at that point, not I'm pissed off because I'm trapped in my house and I can't leave, but, this is it's not acceptable. But, you hear, well, we're in the new normal or the now normal. This isn't normal. And if normal before was people were on the cusp of bankruptcy, if people were living in squalor, if people, were, one step away from being homeless, if people had transportation issues, if that's normal, then that's not acceptable. And so to me, new normal, now normal, we need to get to a better place for the people who live in central New York. And that's my biggest concern right now is where we live. I get what's happening all across New York, especially in New York City, which is very different, than here. But as we're having conversations about COVID, and having conversations about, the ramifications or what's happening, it's triaging now and plans for the future, not just plans for reopening on Friday or, in the next week, but seriously, if and when this comes back around again, we don't want to have to go through the stoppage, and we need to be doing things proactively now. What's breaking my heart today is having conversations today, other than the conversations with the folks with unemployment, which it is so bad, Joe. It's just
Yeah.
bad. But having conversations with people whose family members are in nursing homes, who can't visit their family member, who all of a sudden it's like, okay, now we need to test people 2 times a week, and we need to monitor. That to me is a travesty. And I said to some folks before, in some ways it borders on criminal. Our most vulnerable people are not expendable. It's your mom, it's your grandma, it's
Yeah.
your wife who is in a nursing home. And I've had people crying on the phone saying, my mom died, and now they're in the new COVID numbers, and they couldn't see their mom, that there wasn't PPE available for the folks who are working there. And that's not acceptable for any kind of community, to be in that situation. It's just very sad. We are far behind many other countries as we take care of our most vulnerable populations. I have several either nursing home or assisted living facilities in my district, and there is not one pocket, whether it's at the Nottingham, Van Dyne, Iroquois, Park Central, where it's not been touched. And we saw from Seattle what happened. We should have been on top of that, and we weren't.
Yeah. Amen. Well, go back to questions we got on social media. A friend of mine, Sam, who runs a small business, says, when will the businesses receive the actual help instead of just loans? When will essential workers receive money for working under these new conditions? So he's looking for more assistance than just loans. And will essential workers receive more for having to go out and work in these conditions? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I had this conversation yesterday, and there has been several pieces of legislation and conversation relative to increased pay for essential workers, increased pay for healthcare workers, similar to what hazard pay for somebody in the military would get if they're going into a war zone. Again, and I hate to keep harping on this because we do have a state government, but in order to be able to move something like that forward, you have to have funds to be able to do that. It's interesting with some of these small business and the PPP loans and the CARES Act, and the fine print basically says if you're a millionaire, you're getting a whole bunch of money. And if you're a big box company, you're getting a whole bunch of money. And I have had small businesses call me and say, I wanted the PPP loan, that's the payroll protection, so I could pay my employees, and I filed on the exact day that it opened. The first day, exact day, had all the paperwork, went to the bank, and they said, oh, the money's all gone. But they're like, but I'm not a big depositor, I'm not a big name company, and I'm 5% on this loan that I'm making from a bank, for $4 million is different than the $50,000, that I'm trying to get. And
Right.
that to me is the travesty of these stimulus packages. Not saying that, it wasn't necessary, because it is, but to really reach people where they are, to mainstream the majority of America, it didn't do what it needed to do. I know that there's another package. The House Democrats have a package that they're introducing. It should be voted upon party lines, I think, this week, and they're going to send it to the Senate. And the Senate is probably going to say, no, no, we don't want to do that, and they're going to fight back. But again, this is the time where we need to be pushing back on our representative, and where we need to have somebody fighting for us at the federal level, saying this stimulus money that's coming, it needs to come to your friend, in his organization, in a way that benefits him, like those big companies, those billionaires are getting. You see in California today, Elon Musk is like, I'm breaking the order and I'm coming back to work, and all my workers are coming back too. And it's basically like, what are you going to do, Newsom? You're going to come arrest me? And so basically it's like, I'm going to move my company to Texas, if you, try and stop me. He's a billionaire. Let Joe Schmo down the street with this coffee shop open up, and like that guy in Oswego in his bar, guess what happens? Liquor license gone. And it shouldn't be fair. There shouldn't be disparity with, someone who's just making ends meet with a billionaire. And that's where the federal government has to step up.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. From my friend Ian, how can we get the state legislature back into session, act on some needed laws? Like, can we tax billionaires more so that we can save the funding for our schools, hospitals, and local government services? Rolling furloughs and layoffs are a big problem and will get worse if we don't act quickly. What's your thoughts on that?
Ian. I'm with you, Ian. I'm ready to go back, whether, we have to do things remotely or, need to go back. I mean, this is the responsibility of the legislature. I know it's very difficult because there's more members of the state legislature that live in New York City than not. And they are having a serious health crisis. I mean, when people are dying in their homes, when they're, putting dead, citizens in food trucks, in the back of the morgue, that's really serious. I mean, that's not something that we see here. And, obviously it seems unrealistic, but it's absolutely real. But there are a lot of pieces of legislation, not just revenue, but a lot of pieces of legislation, like my fines and fees legislation, that really are impactful for people every day, that can help you right now today. And I think it is imperative for the legislature to be able to come back. It's up to the, Speaker of the Assembly to call us back. It's up to the majority leader in the Senate to call us back. There's been conversations, we have hearings, we have conference, but that's not bringing the legislature back to vote on pieces of legislation. Specifically, there are revenue enhancing bills that can be put forward that may not be able to cover the deficit that the federal government should supplant. We absolutely have to have the federal government's help. There is no, negotiation about that. Without their help, we will be in a huge, 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 serious situation, which we are in right now.
Yeah.
But that being said, there are definitely revenue enhancement that should have been passed last year that weren't passed, or before we were able to leave. Specifically, the ultra millionaires tax. We're talking about the pied-à-terre tax, where people have a second home. People are like, well, people will leave New York, City, if you're going to tax them, and they're not going to have a second home. That has not stopped the 9 million people who live in New York City already from moving out. And that we're talking about a small percentage of people. We're talking about recreational use for marijuana, which the governor himself in the state of the state said that we were going to do, totally not wanting to talk about it. We're talking about mobile sports betting, where people are going across the bridge to New Jersey to place their bets, and New Jersey's making billions of dollars from New York. And people are like, well, we don't have sports now. Please, I watched UFC, on TV the other night. So things are people, gamble on everything. And I'm not condoning saying you should be gambling. I'm not saying that you should be, smoking, but those things are happening. We could billions of dollars could be raised from those four things that I just mentioned. The Black and Puerto Rican Caucus sent out a press release today. We have been talking about this, saying these need to be immediately on the table, because you're talking about reimagining education, where you're not going to have a classroom and Bill Gates is going to come in and say, all right, let's reimagine, and it should be, electronic, or, use technology. Well, tell that to the rural folks and the folks who don't even have reliable broadband to do the homework that they have now. So we can be doing better. We can, put forward revenue enhancements. But again, the federal government absolutely has to step up to be able to help do that too. And going back to Albany to be able to pass bills is something I feel that's paramount. That there's many pieces of legislation that is critical to help a lot of our citizens.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more on the federal. It's just so maddening to deal with it. Another question from people: what do you feel about the proposed cuts to Medicaid from the governor?
I'm putting my thumbs down. I'm putting my thumbs.
Is that a simple one? We can just say not a fan.
No, well, let me tell you.
Let me
just tell you, Joe. We voted on the Alpha bill. There was about 11 budget bills, and the Alpha bill was one of them. And that included the money for education. It included money for a bunch of different things. It included the Medicaid cuts. It also included the rollbacks for bail reform. It included surrogacy. It included a whole host of things in this budget bill. Very, very controversial. And I voted against it. The bill actually ended up only passing, I believe, by 2 votes, and you have to have 76 votes. It might have been just one, when there was a bigger margin on the Senate side. And for me, if we weren't having conversations about revenue and even introducing revenue, you're talking about cuts, but you're not talking about revenue. I can understand efficiencies, but having school districts that are already underfunded, having, hospital situations and their reimbursements being cut, knowing that our safety net hospitals are already behind, like upstate. The reimbursement for telehealth was decreased. They were taking back the rebates for the pharmacy programs at the hospital to the tune of multi-millions of dollars to the hospitals. All of those cuts mean cuts to staffing, which means cuts to service. And for me, it was taking a stand, saying, I can't, vote for this. And I get the fact that the Senate had already left and it was the night and they had voted on it, and that was agreed upon, between the speaker and the Senate majority leader and the governor. But for me, it just wasn't acceptable. I just feel like, at a time where we need to be having, more extensive conversations, and knowing the state of education, knowing the state of housing, knowing the state of disparity for people who being incarcerated, knowing the state of healthcare, and just saying, no, cut, or this is horrible, but I'm going to vote for it anyway. I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And so Medicaid cuts for our most vulnerable people who are in Medicaid are at the point where they need the most assistance, and saying they're going to be cut. And not only, the folks who need the most assistance, people who are elderly are on Medicaid. People who have disabilities are on Medicaid. What happens with someone who has a nonverbal autistic, child who now can't go to school because it's closed, and their direct care person, hours is cut back. How does that help? What about the socialization? What about the programming? It's like we're leaving the most vulnerable people behind, and it's just not acceptable.
Well, Assemblywoman, I appreciate you so much. Your
and
thoughts.
I appreciate you, Joe Driscoll, for all the work that you're doing in the city.
You do good. You do. It's you actually care, and it's difficult when you're, I just know from being at the council level and watching the mayor and the county executive that the more people you represent, the more difficult stories there are to hear, and the more weight there is on you for big decisions, and the more responsibility that comes. You're also able to move bigger waves and more resources and do stuff. But when you actually care, it can be a real burden. And it's I appreciate you for fighting for those who the most vulnerable in our society. I think that's a big what you're supposed to be doing as a representative, thinking of you don't only think of those who are vulnerable, but they have to be first and foremost in your thought pattern about how this legislation affects people. And I had another. What's
The
that?
future. And the future,
In the future.
bills that we, pass aren't just, for today, but if you're talking about clean air and clean water, it's making sure that, my son or that generation of people has hope, has something to work towards. It's scary that they're doing social, distancing, and they're not in classrooms right now. Everyone's not a remote learner. It's scary, thinking, what's my profession going to be? What's my job going to be if 24 million people in the United States are filing for unemployment? We have to be able to provide, leadership strategy and hope for, not just everyone, but for our young people. We need to make sure that we're leaving something positive behind for them. And that's why, it's very important to be active and to write, to elevate issues and be vocal. And, I'm sure people don't want to hear me talk about, the uh, uninhabitable houses in the district, as I talked about all the time last year. But in elevating, the issue, we were able to bring significant legislation.
Yeah. So I guess I could segue into this one. Um, does the New York State legislature plan to stand against Governor Cuomo in his attempts to both privatize and profitize public education by slashing funding and working with Bill Gates to quote unquote reimagine schools and not including any K through 12 educators on the advisory committee? Now, again, that's not my question. That came from a constituent. So I know this has been a hot topic for a lot of educators. I've seen educators weighing in on both sides of this. So what's your thought? Would you like to push back on any of that question itself, or what's your take on what's happening with education? Because I personally look, I'm a big fan of people with shovels, and I put very little stock in critics at times, because this has hit us all like a tidal wave, and we're all trying to figure out, like, what do we do? Like, we're looking at possibly a year of this where kids aren't going to probably be able to come together in classrooms. So what do you do? So I'm simultaneously sympathetic that how much of this is Governor Cuomo or Bill Gates, and how much of it is just, this is a horrible situation and we're trying to make the best of it that we can. But what's your feeling about that question, and how would you push back, or how would you agree?
Well, first, I think, when I hear reimagine, that's, code word for um, everybody has equal access to learning. So we're just going to make something new. And we all know that that is absolutely not the case.
Right.
So reimagining something means that everyone has to start from the same point. Well, maybe the same point is that nobody is in school, but everyone doesn't have the same access outside of school. So until you make that equal, I think it's going to be very difficult to say you can only have an only technical, out of the classroom learning experience. I don't think that there are some things that you could do remotely, but for the most part, imagine now. You don't even have to imagine; it's happening now, where students have not been in school for a month and a half. They're not seeing other students. They're not seeing their teachers. They're home all day with their parents. Maybe they're able to go outside, maybe they're able to go to a playground, maybe not. And so you're talking, socialization is huge. We're not, people who are just only going to live in a cubby for the rest of our lives. We have to have social skills. It's important for humanity, for us to be able to be around other people. And just so you know how government works, for the folks who are listening, someone can have the best, idea, as far as education is concerned. But at the end of the day, the governor nor Bill Gates Foundation is responsible for the curriculum for the education for people, for the students in New York State. It totally has to be approved by the New York State Department of Education. And we have regents who oversee that. And we actually have a local regent. Her name is Elizabeth Hackinson. She is a retired teacher. She is our regent. And if we have issues and concerns, we need to make sure our regent knows about this. And so they can put forward all of the plans that they want. But it has to be approved by the state education department before it can be rolled out. So, I mean, just, I don't know if that provides comfort or discomfort for folks, but he could come up with a plan tomorrow. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. And we're not saying all things are equal. I am a strong supporter of public education. My son, went to SESD for his entire educational, career. I whoop whoop, and I think I know you're a bulldog. But I think it's important that we continue with that. As far as like the funding is concerned, it needs to be more equitable so that the students who live in areas that have lower funding and have more needs get the equitable funding that they're supposed to have. Again, that's why I voted no for that portion of the budget. And talking about cuts right now to education, we have seen right now where we need to put more money into education, because how do you go through the last semester of your school year? Did you pass? Did you fail? Are you prepared to go to the next grade in September? What does that look like? Are you going to be behind? And I think some of those questions need to be answered as far as where we're going to have our students assessed, where they are right now, compared to let's just reimagine and redo education. Remember, Common Core happened. My son was the first cohort for Common Core in the ninth grade, and they had the lowest Regent scores ever because of Common Core. So we need to be very careful if we're talking about reimagining anything, and especially if you're not talking about having students and parents, engaged in this. Parents right now are home all day with their kids, and they could be working from home and homeschooling, as well. And it makes it very, very difficult to say, okay, now let's just have you, do remote learning. Well, how does that work? Remote learning while your parents are not going to be working anymore, or remote learning from a childcare facility or a community center? Are you assuming that people aren't going to go back to work? Well, where are they going to get money to live? I think things sound great, but show me the details.
Yep. I always love the Beatles revolution. You say you want a revolution. Well, we'd all love to see the plan. What is this what is this revolution? What is this reimagining? What do the details look like? Because the ideas are easy to say. So I'll bring it back to some more questions. A question about what is the status of GNRS's bill to forgive rent? Is that still being talked about? Is it still viable, or are we waiting on a national alternative? There's one being proposed by Ilhan Omar and Sherrod Brown that are being debated. What's your thoughts on that? What are we hearing? What do we think?
Well, if the legislature doesn't go back, we're not going to be voting on any piece of legislation and that bill to be included. The specifics of the bill, again, you were talking about details, and, I had made mention, show me the details. The details of the bill are very vague, and it says that rent should be forgiven, but there should be a fund from the state that supplants or provides money to landlords. And it doesn't really say specifically what landlords or how landlords are going to be included into receiving payment for their rent, but it should be forgiven. Well, remember we started our conversation with the $13 billion, that the state is in deficit. So if we don't have some sort of way to be able to cover the cost of rent, that's going to be a problem. It'll be an issue, because the folks who, own properties, and I'm not talking about, New York City high rise here. I'm talking about people you and I both know who have, maybe they own a two-family home, maybe a couple of two-family homes. And if four people aren't paying their rent, for only a short period of time, maybe that landlord isn't going to have to pay their mortgage. but there's still services that they're providing. There needs to be something concrete to say how are they going to be able to cover that. And so we're having conversations relative to that piece of legislation. I'd like to be able to have some assurance that there is money, real money, to cover this, because the people who will be hurt in the end are the tenants. We pass something without a plan in place and people start getting evicted after the state of emergency is lifted, it'll be for naught. So to me, it is the devil in the details in the piece of legislation, in order to make sure that no one slips through the cracks and people aren't, because of some flaw in the legislation, fall through the cracks, and we get into a situation again where now people are having to move around again to uninhabitable homes, because maybe they didn't qualify to be in this no rent situation. And again, I have been like one of the most vocal tenant advocates outside of the city of New
Yeah.
York, even to a fault, to consternation to many. But I just need to make sure what is the effect going to be, and I want to make sure that we are able to pay for something like that. And again, we can have that conversation back to our federal representatives. What are you going to do to be able to help? We don't want more zombie properties, we don't want more blight, we don't want more uninhabitable properties. But this is real. The city of Syracuse won't ever have enough money to take care of all of the code enforcement needs necessary,
Yeah.
especially if there were to be another wave. We need to be proactive about that.
Yeah. Thank you. It's a great answer. So I just have a couple more. Are you a hard hour stop, or can you go a few minutes over?
Oh, I can go over.
Okay, I'm winding down. I just didn't want to, we're hitting about the hour mark, so I want to try to keep it close. So this question starts with a declaration that Pamela Hunter is terrific.
Thank you. I did paid no one to say that, by the way.
Yeah, right. Come on, we know about your pay plans. Now this is the great Democratic conspiracy.
Yep, we'll hear about that later.
Yes, that'll be a second podcast into the
Yep.
Soros money that Pam Hunter is using on Facebook to get people to say she's terrific. So I'd love to hear the Assemblywoman's thoughts on Stage 4 return, arts and education, particularly arts, festivals, summer education camp. CNY is used to making a lot of money on summer arts and associated businesses. Will we be able to get back to work? Do you see any of it happening? Events, camps, education. How can we put educators, artists who want to get back to work with kids who need supervision? Both seem needed for our mental and emotional health. Yes. I have my own thoughts on that, but I will defer to you first. What's your thoughts on that subject about reopening, getting to phase 4? Are there any realistic timelines? What's your thoughts?
Well, let me just give you a statistic of something that I read earlier today. There has been a 700% increase from the data collected in 2018 of people who are experiencing mental distress or illness. 700% increase. We're talking about 1 in 4 Americans meet the criteria for mental, distress or illness. And that's a statistic from 2018 until now. And so if we say we're not going to have any more types of social gatherings, that number will skyrocket. And we already are in a situation where there's not enough mental health, caregivers. So we have to find ways to make it work. And again, using that reimagine, I don't want to have to use that, but I think that we're going to have to be creative to try to identify doing things perhaps in a different way. I mean, if you're talking about summer programs, say we have summer camps that a lot of our kids go to in the summer. A lot of times they go to these summer camps because parents are working, and this is a way for kids to, supplant where they were going to school and now they're going to camps. well, what is that going to look like, relative to social distancing? And what if it's raining and all of them need to be in a building together? So I think, now we're not at stage 4, we need to be thinking of creatively, how can we make that work going forward? There absolutely has to be a way in order for us to be able to have some sort of community, gathering, especially for our children, because the statistic, specifically relates to young people, and people who have young children are at the highest rate of people with these mental health issues. So we absolutely need to be able to find a way. And our area is great with the arts. I mean, obviously, I love Joe Driscoll and his music, and you have been creative in a way to keep your music going in a time where you're used to being able to go out to different events and play for crowds. And it's not the same. It's not the same of being in person and playing, but you found a way to be creative. And I think, for any of our artists and for programming who has always, catered to young people or catered to groups, I think now we need to be able to identify plans in order to make that happen. We can't sleep on our kids. We can't sleep on young people and the opportunity that they need in order to thrive, especially with this high, mental health distress that we have going on. But it's going to take all of us to kind of put our heads together and collaborating and finding ways to make that work. People need to be able to go to the museum downtown. People need to be able to, play at the Boys and Girls Club. People need to be at the Southwest Community Center and playing basketball at Berry Park. Literally, the hoops are not there. And I can understand why, but something like that is going to have to be, looked at, because, for the mental health and physical health, for our folks, we're going to have to, make that happen. We have time to think about how it's going to work, but we definitely need to be putting plans in place for that. We have to make that happen. We have to.
Yeah, I concur. But it sounds like if I have your because here's the thing, I was talking to a business owner the other day who was kind of like asking my assessment on when these reopening phases were going to happen, and their business is on pause and they're taking out loans and stuff. And my kind of thing was like, it's tough to give you positive advice that like by July your kids are going to be back into a physical. I mean, I live with a biologist, my wife, who's a biology professor. So she's like, no, none of this is happening. So it sounds to me like, in response to her question, it feels kind of like she's asking, do you see summer camps happening? I see, like you're saying, and again, we don't want to say reimagine, but it's going to have to be some variation on the theme.
How it traditionally has been, I can't imagine.
I can't imagine, right?
But, there's something to say that it can't be done in a different way. I mean, if they said, okay, in the southern tier, they're opening up and kids could go back to school, you're not going to put 30 kids in a classroom, today. And how are you going to make that work? And so we're going to have to, do things in a different way. July is right around the corner. We were just at March 18th, and now we're already in May. And think that, July is like, oh, it seems like a far ways away. It isn't a far way away. But we have to be able to identify some kind of, strategy. And, I'm not saying, oh, it's hope and optimism, but sooner or later, it will open up. To what extent? We just want to be prepared for that, because our young people, deserve that. But to the way that it looked like before,
yeah,
it's going to be hard to be able to see that happening.
Yeah, it's not,
at least in the near term.
Yes, I concur. So I just have one last question from Facebook and social media for you. This is a woman who has been homeschooling her son for the past 2 years. Currently, New York State provides no support for homeschoolers. The state of California offers homeschooling parents $2,600 a year in educational funds per kid. Do you think it would be possible, or something that the legislature would be interested in, to establish something like this for New York State parents? Since the shutdown, she's been looking at the Syracuse City School District resources they have on their website, and she's wondering if that might be a possibility for homeschool kids to utilize the online programs that public school kids are using. So kind of a two-part question there, but what are your thoughts about that?
I think right now, as we're reimagining education, that is the perfect time to, integrate, folks who are doing homeschooling. Why I have been, obviously a staunch supporter of public education, public schools. Obviously, parents have choice. And if they want to stay, home and do the homeschooling, absolutely, that's a great option, for them. Being able to identify resources again. We started the conversation with money and resources, and I hate that everything always surrounds money, and especially having the conversation about, and it's not even deflecting, but it's fact, needing help from the federal government. But I think if there be a time to be able to incorporate something like that, now is the time, especially as, and I don't want to take that lightly that everyone is homeschooling, because that's not necessarily the case. I mean, students are at home and they're doing school, but I don't want that to, lessen parents who have been homeschooling, and been doing that for a long period of time, and the curriculums that they're going through. So I think for that parent who said, they're getting the $2,600, I think, that should be something, a recommendation that's forwarded to this, group, to be looked at. And especially being able to get the curriculum from the city school district. I mean, New York State Education Department is responsible to educate all students in the state, in some manner, and being partners. And so, having access to be able to provide school similar to what everybody else is receiving, doesn't seem so far fetched to me. So I think now, if there ever be a time, it's now. But again, being able to have a new expense, with a huge deficit, that is something that definitely we're going to need federal, support from. And it'd be great if you could get our congressperson on this with you to have this conversation, to say, hey, PS, by the way, where you at? Because we absolutely, sound the alarm. I know the mayor has sent, his letter to Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, and, the governor, every other day is saying, we need help. And this is not just posturing, this is reality.
Yeah.
And we need to hear it, because what happens is we don't get resources, the services that municipalities cut, like the sidewalk program, it's not going to be able to happen with the, snow shoveling. And then it will be a road, and then it'll be a bridge, and then it'll be, we'll pick up your garbage every other week and not every week. And I'm not saying that's happening. I'm just saying
it's
sooner or later,
what people are going to have to start looking at.
Yeah. The bow breaks.
Yeah. People are going to have to start looking at. And that's something that, it's been really frustrating because, people think it's partisanship, or, what they call Trump derangement syndrome, that I keep pointing to the federal government. But, this is something that obviously my career beforehand was, I was a musician, and I cared an awful lot about politics, and I read an awful lot about politics. And I was raised in a very political family. So it was always something I was paying attention to, but not until I was in the game did I really realize, the stratification and the purviews that each different level has. If the mayor wants to handle the lead crisis, he can't until a counselor advances that legislation. And if I want to change how SPD functions and what I can't do that. If I want to fire or hold a police officer accountable, that's something only Chief Buckner can do. And yes, there are levels of influence, but we all have our roles to play. The state, what you can do from the state, you can't do what a city councilor does, and I can't do what a state legislature does. And it really has to be relayed to people who are, I'm not trying to be patronizing or explaining something to people who already understand it, but the federal government, the crisis is a national crisis that's too big for any city, county, or state to handle on its own. It will affect the national economy. And like they said, if we fix
it already is.
And it already is. And we're going to be walloped at the municipal level and at the state level. And we're going to say, hey, federal, remember all those years we paid all that federal tax to you, this is a national crisis. This falls squarely on the federal government, preventing this from getting to the state it did. If you look at New Zealand, if you look at South Korea, their national leaders, their version of the federal government stepped in and developed smart policies, proactive testing, national testing, and they dealt with this thing. And now that it's, the genie's out of the bottle because she didn't take it seriously in the beginning, and now you have to react. And that's not partisan because we have a Republican president, or I don't like Trump or whatever. This is how it works. You don't get elected. You and I have talked about this a dozen times. You don't get elected to make speeches or to bully people on Twitter. When you have constituents calling you, that's what the job of government is. And, the federal government's going to have to step up and actually address these shortfalls that are going to happen from municipal governments and county governments and state governments. And, well, that's my rant for the day, but, I'm
but to add on to your rant, just to make sure that folks know, we, New York State, including obviously New York City, the whole entire 19 million people that encompasses New York State, we are a donor state. We give more money to the federal government than we give back. So for someone like Mitch McConnell, to say, let them go bankrupt, or we don't want to help blue states, we're helping you. We're helping Kentucky. We're helping all of those states who don't give any money to the federal government. So that's not something I want to hear. And we have the most cases and deaths in New York State. And so to say, let you, falter is just not going to be acceptable. We didn't know this was going to, happen and escalate the way that it did. But make no mistake, I mean, we give a lot of money to the federal government, and for them to, go figure it out on your own, that's not going to be acceptable. But you know what you can do? November's coming round. If people aren't doing what, they need to be doing, in order to help the people who live here, speak. Democracy speaks, and that equals voting.
Don't get angry, vote, right? Isn't that what Obama said? Well, my two favorites, I think, are when Cuomo said, you can't pass the buck without passing the bucks. And I think that's it. Like Trump's going, well, it's all up to the states. States got to figure it out. Okay, well, give us that money we paid you. We want that $100 billion back right now from the constituents, from the 19 million people in New York State who have paid into this federal system. Okay, that's cool. It's all on us. The federal government suddenly, as of last month, provides no services to anybody in the country. Okay, give us the money back, because you can't pass the buck without passing the bucks. And I think it's, as much flack as we take as representatives. I think it's exemplified when Cuomo says, if anyone's got beef with it, call me. And don't get me wrong, I think everybody has issues with Cuomo one way or another. I'm not deifying him, but I respect someone who will at least say, look, I've made a decision. This is my decision. You don't like it? Yeah, come at me. I made a decision and it's unpopular, but I'm standing by it because this is what I believe. Rather than someone who says one thing Tuesday, another thing Wednesday, another thing Thursday, and changes their story each 4 days, and then says, I take no responsibility for anything that's happening. It's just the antithesis of leadership from the federal level. And it's just, and that's not because I have Trump derangement syndrome. Everybody's been, you can look at my Facebook posts and my social posts. I haven't talked about Trump in 2 years. When he's out there doing his thing, I'm just, I have my opinions. I'm not out here. But right now, this is serious. This is a tragedy. This is a crisis.
It's literally life or
death. And it's only going to get worse. And guess what? Like you were pointing out, this is a national problem, a national crisis. We need our federal representatives to step up and hey, man, it's a huge problem. I'm sorry. I'm glad. I'm really glad that I'm lowest on the totem pole at this stage. I mean, if I was higher up, but it's tough to a lot of what I'm doing is just shuffling my constituents to people at the state level, to people at the federal level. And that's not a small task. I'm not minimizing it, but to be in Cuomo's shoes and to make those calls all the time, this is tough stuff, and I don't know. I'll stop ranting, but I do think it's important to note that this isn't partisanship. This is just what the federal government should be doing right now.
100% agree.
Well, anyway, Pamela Hunter, thank you. You've been such a inspiration to me and a mentor, and I appreciate you deeply. And you know, as the first African American woman to hold both this seat, this assembly seat for this region at the state level, and as the first African woman county chair, all that, you've just been amazing and kick-ass at what you do, regardless of any historical firsts. You're just an amazing person and representative, and I appreciate you so much. And thank you for coming on.
It's my pleasure. You're awesome. Hopefully, I was able to, provide some specific answers, for folks if people want to follow up. They know how to find me on Facebook or email or calling my office, and we'll grind through it. We are definitely in this together. We will fail together or succeed together.
Yep. And I can tell everyone out there, this isn't just lip service. I've sent a lot of people to Assemblywoman Hunter's office, and, her team has done great. So thanks everyone for tuning in to check me and the Assemblywoman here at the my new show called the Salt City Grind. We're going to keep this going. On Thursday, we got our boy John Mannion, who's running for state senate, and so we're going to have him in. Again, it's been great having all your questions coming in. If you have questions for John Mannion, please leave them in the comments, and I'll keep plugging that. That's going to be Thursday at 5 o'clock. I'd also take feedback from anyone. Pam and I have had some conversations about, is 5 o'clock the best hour? Should it be at 7 o'clock? Are Tuesdays and Thursdays good? Any of that feedback is appreciated. Any feedback is appreciated. And once again, this podcast, the Salt City Grind, this is the first episode. We're going to have it up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, all those good places. So you can check us on a lot of different mediums. And I want to thank you guys. I can see from the numbers, it's kind of distracting. I want to figure out how to take that out, actually. But I'm seeing the metrics. People have been watching. People have been tuning in and enjoying it. So thank you all for joining us, and we're going to keep this going. And again, it's going to be, it's not going to just be politics. Whatever issues I think are relevant to the political health of our community, I'm going to follow issues and topics and whatever tickles my fancy. So, so thank you again for your leadership, Assemblywoman. We appreciate you deeply. And
thank you.
With that, we'll sign out. Peace and love. Peace and love, everybody. Take care, my friend.